Abstract. This essay explores the Russian Western civilizational divide through an integrated analysis of Oswald Spengler's concept of pseudomorphosis, Vadim Tsimbursky's theory of cyclical abductions of Europe, and the medieval political-theological conflict between Guelphs and Ghibellines. It argues that Russia has preserved and developed a buried strand of Western civilization, the Ghibelline, imperial sacral paradigm, which the Latin West abandoned with the rise of papal supremacy, the Enlightenment, and liberal democracy. This buried identity continues to animate Russia's recurring interventions in Europe as acts of civilizational reclamation. The essay thus reinterprets Russian history as a series of dialectical reassertions of an alternative Western path, suppressed in Europe but maintained east of the Dnieper. The shadow of the Ghibellines. Berdyaev's notion of the New Middle Ages and Goff's conception of the Middle Ages as the foundation of Western civilization converge in the recognition that the medieval synthesis of faith and order has never disappeared but persists beneath modernity's secular surface. Both Nikolai Berdyaev and Jacques-Élie Goff reject the Enlightenment's caricature of the Middle Ages as a dark, stagnant period. For both, it was instead a world of unity, metaphysical, moral, and cultural, a civilization where all spheres of life were integrated into a single divine order. For Berdyaev, the medieval epoch represented the era of the sacral cosmos, when being itself was radiant with divine meaning. It was an age of objectivity, in which truth was not man-made but revealed, descending from the transcendent order of God. Élie Goff, from a historical perspective, described the Middle Ages as a coherent symbolic universe, a civilization structured by a unified imaginaire chrétien that organized time, labor, hierarchy, and salvation within a theocentric framework. Thus, for both thinkers, the Middle Ages represent the last epoch of ontological unity, the final age in which the divine, the social, and the natural formed a single, meaningful whole. Berdyaev's The New Middle Ages, 1924, diagnoses modernity as a civilization that has severed its bond with transcendence. The Renaissance and Enlightenment, in emancipating man from the sacred order, created a culture of freedom without meaning, a horizontal world bereft of spiritual depth. Modern man, liberated from divine authority, found himself enslaved to mechanism, economics, and mass society. Yet for Berdyaev, history is not linear but dialectical. The Middle Ages were not erased but hidden within modernity's depths, awaiting resurrection. He predicted that, in the era of modernism's decline, humanity would once again rediscover the need for a sacral, symbolic cosmos. This new Middle Ages would not restore feudal institutions but revive the medieval synthesis of spirit and form in a transfigured key, a civilization of renewed hierarchy, cosmic symbolism, and spiritual order. In this sense, Berdyaev foresaw what Élie Goff later demonstrated historically, that modernity never fully escaped the Middle Ages but continually carried its archetypes, myths, and moral structures within itself. In La civilisation de l'Occident médiéval, 1964, Élie Goff argued that the medieval world was not an interlude between antiquity and modernity but the matrix from which the modern West was born. The rationalization of time, the transformation of work into vocation, and the invention of purgatory as a theological and psychological space all emerged from the medieval synthesis. Élie Goff's historiography dismantles the myth of rupture. Modernity, he writes, did not abolish the Middle Ages but secularized them. The forms of medieval imagination, eschatology, moral dualism, symbolic time persist in modern political and cultural life in hidden or inverted forms. Where Berdyaev reads this persistence as the return of the sacred, Élie Goff reads it as historical continuity. Both, however, converge on a crucial truth. The Middle Ages did not end. They were transformed. In the global disintegration of liberal modernity, Berdyaev's prophecy acquires renewed relevance. The secular West, having lost the metaphysical foundations of its order, finds itself haunted by the ghost of the very world it sought to escape. The collapse of universalist ideologies and the crisis of meaning signal not merely political upheaval but a spiritual inversion, the reawakening of the medieval archetype in new form. Goff's historical continuity and Berdyev's eschatological vision converge here. The medieval order, with its sense of hierarchy, transcendence, and symbolic meaning, has returned to challenge the modern flatness of existence. In Russia's persistence as a civilization grounded in sacred authority, one can discern the re-emergence of the Ghibelline spirit, the final refuge of a world where power remains theological and sovereignty divine. Berdyev's New Middle Ages and Goff's Long Middle Ages meet in a single historiosophical insight: the medieval world was never vanquished. It remains the hidden foundation of modernity, now resurfacing in the exhaustion of secular civilization. The Middle Ages, far from being a failed experiment, were a civilization of spiritual totality that continues to haunt and inspire the modern world. In the East, in the Byzantine-Ghibelline synthesis preserved by Russia, the sacred empire endures as the living memory of that totality. Thus, as the modern world declines into fragmentation, the circle of history closes. The Middle Ages return not as nostalgia, but as destiny. Chapter 1. Byzantine Symphonia and the Political Theology of Empire. The Byzantine Empire developed a distinctive model of church-state relations known as symphonia, wherein the emperor and the patriarch acted in harmony to uphold divine order on earth. Unlike the Augustinian dualism of the Latin West, Byzantine political theology conceived the emperor as a katechon, 2 Thess 2:6-7, a restraining force against the chaos of history, charged with the defense of orthodoxy and the maintenance of cosmic order. The emperor was both a political and spiritual figure, not as a priest but as a divinely sanctioned ruler. This framework of integrated sacred sovereignty established a theological political ontology in which the state was not a necessary evil but a positive divine instrument. With the decline of Byzantium and the coronation of Charlemagne in 800, Western Christendom began asserting its own claim to universal empire. The Ottonian and later Stauffen dynasties fully embraced the doctrine of translatio imperii, asserting that imperial authority had passed from Rome to Constantinople and now to the Latin West. The Holy Roman Emperors, especially under the Stauffens, Frederick I Barbarossa, Frederick II, developed a political theology that mirrored and rivaled Byzantium. They viewed the empire as a divine institution parallel to the Church, and the emperor as a Christ-like figure, vicarius Christi within the secular order. The Latin conquest of Constantinople in 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, symbolized not merely a geopolitical rupture but a theological statement. The destruction of the Byzantine Empire eliminated a rival universalist claim, affirming the Western imperial order as the singular Christian empire. This act completed the Ghibelline vision of political exclusivity: there could be only one universal Christian empire. In the conflict between Guelphs, Populists, and Ghibellines, imperialists, we observe the Western re-articulation of the Byzantine synthesis. The Ghibelline position asserted that imperial authority derived directly from God, not from the Pope, and that the emperor was sovereign in both spiritual and temporal matters within his domain. This view directly opposed papal theocracy, which positioned the Pope as superior to all secular rulers. While the Ghibellines lost the political battle in medieval Europe, their ideology persisted in subterranean currents of political theology, reemerging in the imperial thought of Dante, Machiavelli, and later absolutist theorists. Chapter 2. Moscow as the Third Rome, Eastern Ghibellinism. Following the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Grand Duchy of Moscow proclaimed itself the Third Rome. The idea, formulated by the monk Philotheus, stated, 2 Romes have fallen. The third stands, and there will be no fourth. In adopting the title of Tsar, from Caesar, and asserting itself as the guardian of Orthodox Christianity, Russia assumed the Byzantine mantle. However, in addition to this, the architectural symbolism of the Kremlin battlements, the M-shaped swallow's tail characteristic of the Ghibellines, is an architectural paraphrase of the double-headed eagle adopted as a coat of arms, a symbol of the centralization of church and imperial power under the Tsar, points to the Russian civilizational logic that inherited and institutionalized the Ghibelline worldview. The walls and towers of the Moscow Kremlin, rebuilt in the late 15th century under Ivan III, bear a distinct architectural feature: swallowtail or dovetail merlins, also known as Ghibelline battlements. This design, associated with the pro-imperial Ghibelline faction in medieval Italy, was used to signal allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor and opposition to the Pope. Italian Renaissance architects, such as Aristotele Fioravanti and Aloisio da Milano, were commissioned by Ivan III to reconstruct the Kremlin. They brought with them northern Italian military and civic architectural styles, including Ghibelline merlins. Though their adoption in Moscow may have originated as a stylistic borrowing, their placement on the Kremlin, the seat of Russian autocracy, imbued them with unmistakable ideological overtones. By adorning the Kremlin with Ghibelline battlements, Ivan III visually aligned Muscovy with the tradition of sacral empire independent of papal or Western spiritual authority. This act echoed the Ghibelline claim that imperial power derived directly from God and need not be mediated through the papacy. In the Russian context, it signaled the assertion of a new, Orthodox-centered imperial authority. In 1472, Sofia Palaiologina, the niece of the last Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, married Grand Prince Ivan III of Moscow. This dynastic union symbolically transferred the legacy of Constantinople to the Russian court. With the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Sofia became the living link between the fallen Eastern Roman Empire and the ascendant Muscovite state. Her marriage to Ivan III provided the Russian dynasty with a tangible connection to Byzantine imperial legitimacy. Sofia's influence extended beyond dynastic symbolism. She introduced elements of Byzantine ceremonial culture into the Muscovite court, fostering a new imperial self-understanding. While Sofia did not articulate the Third Rome doctrine herself, her presence made it conceivable. Russian ecclesiastical and political elites, recognizing the ideological vacuum left by Byzantium's collapse, would later develop the theory in full, notably in the writings of Philotheos of Pskov in the early 16th century. The combination of Sofia Palaiologina's dynastic presence and the architectural borrowing from the Ghibelline West produced a unique synthesis. Moscow inherited from Byzantium the theological notion of symphonia, harmony between church and state, and from the Ghibelline tradition, the assertion of sovereign imperial independence. Importantly, the Ghibelline tradition itself was already a Western adaptation of Byzantine political theology. The Holy Roman Emperors of the Stauffen dynasty, who opposed papal supremacy, conceived of their rule in terms reminiscent of the Byzantine basileus as a cataconic and soteriological authority within a Christian universal empire. In this sense, Ghibellinism preserved and reinterpreted key elements of Byzantine sacral kingship in a Latin context. When these elements returned to Eastern soil through the Moscow court and the Third Rome ideology, it marked not merely a synthesis but a kind of symbolic homecoming. Ghibellinism, having originated in Western attempts to emulate Byzantine theocracy, returned via Muscovy to its Eastern spiritual and political roots. This hybrid laid the groundwork for the formulation of the Third Rome doctrine, which would position Muscovy not just as the successor to Constantinople but as the final Christian empire, eschatologically significant and geopolitically autonomous. Sofia Palaiologina's marriage to Ivan III and the Ghibelline architecture of the Kremlin were not merely incidental developments but fundamental to Muscovy's transformation into an imperial theological state. Together, they infused the Russian political imagination with both Eastern and Western traditions of sacred sovereignty, culminating in the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome. In this ideological fusion, Ghibellinism returned to the Byzantine tradition from which it had originally drawn its deepest inspiration. Like the Ghibellines, the Russian Tsar was conceived as a divinely sanctioned sovereign, both political ruler and protector of the faith. This self-conception placed Russia outside the papal Guelph paradigm and aligned it with the Ghibelline tradition of sacred empire. The Orthodox Church, subordinated but integrated into the state, functioned in a relationship reminiscent of Symphonia, particularly under the reforms of Peter the Great and later under the Soviet project of state atheism as a secular sacrality. In contemporary geopolitical theory, Russia continues to operate within a Ghibelline logic. The state's self-understanding as a sovereign civilizational pole, resisting liberal universalism, parallels the Ghibelline resistance to papal, and by extension, globalist, hegemony. The Russian Federation's emphasis on sovereign democracy, the integration of orthodox symbolism in state ideology, and its critique of Western secularism all echo the political-theological structure of sacred empire. Alexander Dugin, among others, explicitly invokes the Ghibelline tradition in constructing a multipolar world order. In this view, Western liberalism corresponds to the Guelph model. It universalizes its values and institutions, often through supranational mechanisms. Russia, as a Ghibelline actor, upholds a pluralist, culturally rooted sovereignty grounded in spiritual and historical traditions. The confrontation between the Guelph and Ghibelline paradigms is not merely a medieval curiosity but a recurring structure in the history of political theology. The Ghibelline model, rooted in Byzantine ontology, insists on the divine vocation of political sovereignty and the integration of spiritual meaning into statecraft. In contrast, the Guelph model advances the autonomy of spiritual power and the subordination of temporal authority to universal moral norms. In today's geopolitical landscape, Russia embodies a neo-Ghibelline civilizational project, challenging the secular liberal order of the West and proposing an alternative vision of political sacrality and imperial continuity. This opposition reveals not the obsolescence but the enduring relevance of medieval political theologies in the age of global ideological conflict. Conventional narratives treat the Russian-Western divide as a cultural antinomy between Eastern despotism and Western liberty. However, such a view underestimates the internal complexity of Western history and oversimplifies Russia's civilizational self-conception. Since the Muscovite period, and especially after the fall of Constantinople, Russia has seen itself not as alien to the West, but as its true successor. This self-image, crystallized in the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome, carries not only theological import but also political and imperial weight. A reassessment of this position demands a return to the deeper structural cleavages within the West itself, especially the long-forgotten Guelph-Ghibelline conflict, whose suppressed legacy finds renewed expression in the Russian experience. To understand this properly, we must revisit the deeper structures of Western history, especially the unresolved Guelph-Ghibelline conflict, and read Russian history not as deviant, but as the survival of a repressed civilizational model. Russia is not a civilizational outsider but a rival claimant to Western identity and heir not to the liberal Guelphic West, but to its Ghibelline double, the sacral, imperial vision of a unified state and church. The rise of Moscow as the Third Rome marks the preservation of an abandoned Western potential. Understanding the current crisis of globalization requires recognizing this latent duality and the necessity of reconciling it through a civilizational peace. This interpretation deepens our understanding of the Russian-Western divide not as geopolitical rivalry but as a civilizational conflict of unfinished Western history, with Russia insisting on its right to embody a path the West abandoned. Chapter 3. Spenglerian Pseudomorphosis and the Russian Path. Oswald Spengler introduced the idea of pseudomorphosis to explain cultural deformation, when a young civilization is forced to develop within the symbolic forms of an older one, its native energies are misdirected. In the Russian case, this deformation begins with Peter the Great's forced westernization, and continues through the Soviet era and post-Soviet liberalism. The forms are Western, administration, science, law, but the underlying cultural rhythm is not. Spengler saw Russia as a young, still developing culture stunted by the premature adoption of a foreign civilizational shell. Yet pseudomorphosis is not mere imitation. It often preserves deeper, archaic forms beneath imposed surfaces. In Russia's case, this archaic form is the sacral unity of church and empire, a Byzantine inheritance with strong Ghibelline resonances. Oswald Spengler's concept of pseudomorphosis offers a powerful lens through which to examine the tensions in Russian modernization. Pseudomorphosis describes the condition wherein a younger culture develops within the formal shell of an older, alien one, resulting in a stunted or distorted expression of its own life form. In the Russian context, this dynamic was inaugurated with Peter the Great's enforced Europeanization, continuing through the Soviet adoption of Marxism and the liberal reforms of the post-Soviet era. Despite outward assimilation, the native cultural rhythm remained resistant to full absorption. Rather than erasing Russia's indigenous trajectory, pseudomorphosis has served as a preservative structure housing within Western institutional forms a latent civilizational identity inherited from Byzantium. This identity, sacral, autocratic, theocratic, has clear affinities with the political theological order defended by the Ghibellines in the medieval West. In Russia, Westernized elites from Peter the Great onward imposed European models onto a non-Western civilizational body. But this overlay did not erase the native form, it concealed and preserved it. Russia remained imperial, orthodox, and autocratic beneath a surface of constitutionalism, socialism, or capitalism. This disjunction is not a failure of modernization but evidence of a deeper civilizational rhythm resistant to liberal teleology. Each new regime or ideology, orthodoxy, Tsarism, Marxism, liberalism, enters Russia as a foreign body. It is internalized, gestated, and ultimately replaced by something radically other. This replacement is catastrophic, not transitional. It tears apart the existing political and symbolic body. This is Spenglerian pseudomorphosis, not as cultural analogy, but as biopolitical horror. An organism using the shell of another to birth its own form. Russia's function in world history may be to disrupt the illusions of continuity, stability, and rationality. It serves as a reminder that civilizations can mutate, that identity is not always preserved, that history is not always progress. The Russian body politic is a matrix of gestation, not a final form. Whether one sees this as a blessing or a curse depends on whether one believes in historical stability or metaphysical metamorphosis. Russia, in this view, is the civilization that devours itself to be reborn. If the West ages through gradual decay, Russia remains perpetually young but at the price of amnesia. Each new form obliterates the memory of its predecessor. Russia's youth is not natural, it is artificially induced by civilizational trauma. Chapter 4. The Lost West. Medieval Europe was torn between two political theological visions. Guelphs upheld the primacy of the Pope, spiritual power over temporal. Ghibellines defended imperial sovereignty as sacral and ultimate. With the Reformation, Enlightenment, and modern nation-state, the Guelphic vision, secularized into liberalism and legalism, won the West. But the Ghibelline path was not erased, it was driven underground. It survives not in Italy or Germany, but in Byzantium's heir, Russia. Ivan III's ideological self-positioning as heir to the Byzantine and Roman imperial line completes this sacral continuity. In Russia, the Tsar was both Caesar and high priest, a synthesis the West abandoned. The medieval conflict between Guelphs, papal spiritualists, and Ghibellines, Imperial Sacralists, defines the internal fracture of Western civilization. The West chose the Guelphic path, eventually secularized into Enlightenment rationalism, legal positivism, and liberal democracy. But the Ghibelline vision survived in the East. With the fall of Constantinople, Moscow became its living archive, an empire of spiritual political unity. The Kremlin's architecture, the Tsar's dual status, and the Orthodox Church's role all point to this enduring legacy. The West forgot its Ghibelline twin, Russia never did. Papal spiritualism was secularized into Enlightenment rationalism, liberal legalism, and the separation of church and state. The Guelph-Ghibelline conflict, dominant in Italy and the Holy Roman Empire from the 12th to the 14th centuries, revolved around the question of ultimate authority: should power rest with the Pope, Guelph, or the Emperor, Ghibelline? More than a political dispute, it was a metaphysical struggle over the structure of sovereignty, jurisdiction, and communal life. The Guelph vision affirmed a multipolar social order: guilds, city-states, universities, monastic orders, all under the moral authority of the Church. The Ghibelline model pursued hierarchical unification under imperial law and military order, emphasizing the unity of Christendom through worldly sovereignty. These archetypes never vanished, instead, they migrated into new forms. By the 20th century, the Ghibelline principle had long since disappeared in the West. The Enlightenment, Protestantism, and liberal democracy, all heirs of the Guelph triumph, had destroyed the vision of universal empire and sacred politics. Russia, however, carried this alternative tradition into modernity, albeit in secularized form. Nicholas Berdyaev understood Russian communism as a mutation of Christian eschatology. Berdyaev saw communism as both a tragedy and a revelation. It was tragic because it deformed Russia's spiritual heritage into violent utopia, but it was also revelatory, because it proved that Russia's messianic and imperial drive could not be erased. In this light, communism was not a deviation but a continuation of Russia's Ghibelline essence. Far from being a purely Western ideology imposed upon Russia, Marxism was transformed into a Russian messianic project, driven by the same spiritual energies that had animated Orthodoxy and Russian religious philosophy. Communism became a secular heresy of Orthodoxy, retaining its longing for universality and salvation, but redirecting it toward the earthly realm of class struggle and utopia. For Berdyaev, this explained both the intensity and the tragedy of the Soviet experiment. Russian history bore the imprint of Byzantium, centralized authority, sacralized empire, and a supra-individual conception of destiny. In the West, this same ethos had once been embodied by the Ghibellines, who fought to preserve the universal principle of empire against the particularist and pluralist Guelphs. Berdyaev's communism can thus be seen as a continuation of this Byzantine, Ghibelline orientation, the primacy of the whole over the part, of transcendence over atomized individualism. In Spenglerian terms, Russian communism functioned as a pseudomorphosis. Outwardly, it adopted the ideological shell of Marxism, a doctrine born in the West. Inwardly, however, it preserved the Ghibelline Byzantine principle of universal empire and collective destiny. The Soviet Union, then, was less a Marxist state than a pseudomorphic Ghibelline empire, continuing the struggle against the Guelph West under revolutionary symbols. Its rhetoric of class struggle disguised an ancient civilizational logic. Thus, even in its apparent betrayal of Christianity, Russia remained faithful to its deeper vocation, to serve as the counter-West, the last empire, the enduring echo of the Ghibelline dream in a world ruled by Guelph modernity. In modern times, the medieval dichotomy re-emerges as competing paradigms of state, economy, and society. The pluralistic market order of the West and the centralized communal order of the communist world. Zinoviev's account makes clear that this is not a matter of continuity in surface features, but of deep civilizational structures. Richard Pipes, in his seminal works such as Russia Under the Old Regime, asserts that Russia has historically diverged from the Western European path due to the absence of private property, legal pluralism, and civil society. Zinoviev, by contrast, proposes that Russia represents not a divergence from the West, but a different tendency within its evolution, the communal, integrative path opposed to the pluralistic, liberal one. Pipes characterizes Russia as fundamentally non-Western due to several persistent structural features. Patrimonialism, the state precedes society and owns it as property. Lack of legal property rights, no tradition of private ownership independent of the state. Absence of civil society, nobility and peasantry were both dependent on the autocracy. Authoritarian statehood, the Tsar, and later the Communist Party, monopolized all power. According to Pipes, these features are not temporary aberrations but rooted in Russia's historical experience, especially its Mongol heritage and Muscovite autocracy. He sees modern Russian authoritarianism as the survival of pre-modern, pre-Western patterns. In contrast, Alexander Zinoviev proposes that Russia embodies one of two civilizational logics within the broader evolution of the West. One Westernism, or Americanism fragmented, pluralist, market-driven, and institutionalized, epitomized by the USA. Two Communism, or Sovietism integrated, collectivist, centralized, and ideological, epitomized by the USSR. Zinoviev contends that both tendencies are not mutually exclusive but dialectically related. Each contains elements of the other, and both evolved from the same European civilizational base. Westernism follows the logic of differentiation and pluralism, Guelph, while communism realizes the logic of unification and totality, Ghibellines. From this perspective, Russia did not diverge from the West but fulfilled a suppressed aspect of it. Patrimonial monarchy in the early Middle Ages. Subordination of church to state before the Gregorian reforms. Lack of private property rights before Roman law revival in the 12th century. Absence of bourgeois autonomy before the rise of towns and parliaments. Beginning around the 11th century, Western Europe underwent a series of revolutions, legal, ecclesial, economic, political, which gradually marginalized the Ghibelline logic. The investiture controversy created a church-state divide. The Magna Carta limited royal power. The bourgeois revolutions in England and France established liberal constitutionalism. Zinoviev's insight is that the communal logic did not disappear, it was preserved and realized by Russia. Thus, what Pipes sees as pre-modern regression, Zinoviev sees as the delayed flowering of an alternative modernity. In the post-Cold War world, Westernism appeared triumphant. Yet Zinoviev argues that globalization is not the victory of pluralism over communality, but their integration at a higher level. Western societies now resemble human anthills, technocratically managed, centrally coordinated, ideologically unified. The authoritarian tendencies of modern democracies reflect not deviation, but the inner necessity of stabilizing pluralism. Thus, Pipes's critique and Zinoviev's theory converge. The Ghibelline logic is not confined to Russia, it has been reabsorbed by the victorious West. Globalization is the universalization of the very dialectic that once appeared to divide East and West. Rather than viewing Russia as a failed or incomplete West, we should recognize it as an instantiation of an alternative Western logic. Pipes provides the empirical detail of Russia's divergence, Zinoviev provides the conceptual architecture to interpret it. In this synthesis, Russia is not the negation of the West but its dialectical counterimage, the Ghibelline face of a civilization that historically chose the Guelph path. In the age of global integration, this forgotten path returns not in opposition to the West, but as its hidden double. The historical division of Western civilization into Guelph and Ghibelline factions anticipates a deeper structural polarity that persists into the modern era. The Ghibelline path with its sacral fusion of state and faith was not only defeated but effaced. And yet, this effaced order found refuge and continuity in the East after 1453, in Muscovite Russia. In contrast to the Guelphic West, Russia did not divorce sacred and political authority, but unified them in a structure that resisted both papal and democratic sovereignty. Chapter 5. Abductions of Europe and the Last Ghibelline Stronghold. Vadim Tsimbursky described Russian-European relations in terms of recurring abduction cycles. Moments when Russia breaks into Europe to assert itself as part of the community of political nations, only to be rebuffed and rolled back. Each cycle follows a pattern. Russia destroys spatial barriers and allies with core Europe. Move A, Europe recoils and retaliates. Move B, Russia counters with expansive hegemony. Move C, the West contains or defeats it. Move D. If we follow baseline that pseudomorphosis leads from internal colonization to external colonization, Tsimbursky completes this arc by showing how even Russian resistance to the West is coded within Western forms. In this way, his idea gains even more depth. Russia's geopolitical fate is to be colonized by the European image of itself, one that it first installs, then rebels against, only to find that even rebellion mimics the same form. In the end, pseudomorphosis and Tsimbursky's cycles both reveal not a conflict between Russia and the West, but a deeper split, between Russia and its own pseudomorphic identity, which repeats like a tragic loop. Russia, as a non-Western civilization, seeks to be recognized as European. It imports Western forms, state, ideology, culture. The West recoils and resists. Russia expands and asserts itself through force. The West contains or defeats Russia. Russia retreats and the cycle begins again. Tsimbursky describes how, from Peter I onward, Russia has repeatedly sought recognition and membership in the community of political nations by aligning itself with Europe politically, militarily, and symbolically. This process is not merely strategic, it is civilization ally mimetic. Russia sees itself through the eyes of Europe, and builds itself in response to that gaze. This is pure pseudomorphosis in Spenglerian terms. Russia's development occurs under the pressure of an alien cultural form, and every attempt to become Europe involves an overlay of foreign structures on a non-Western civilizational core. Even Bolshevik or Stalinist geopolitics, though radically anti-European in rhetoric, nonetheless mirrors European order-building projects. Example: Trotsky's United States of Europe, Stalin's spheres of influence, Brezhnev's Warsaw Pact. These are forms taken from European history, applied to a non-European platform. This is not merely a geopolitical pattern but a civilizational trauma, driven by internal colonization of the Russian elite by Western ideals, exactly as pseudomorphosis describes. It expresses the tension between a civilization still structured by imperial sacral logic, Russia, and one structured by post-Guelphic liberal modernity, Europe. Russia's expansions are not just strategic, they are civilizational acts, attempts to reassert a suppressed model of the West. Each cycle beginning with Peter the Great and repeating through the Napoleonic Wars, World Wars, and the Cold War follows a four-part structure. Each Russian abduction of Europe, its imperial expansion westward followed by Western backlash, is not just geopolitical. It is the return of a suppressed civilizational archetype, imperial sacral power asserting itself against a desacralized, liberal West. This casts Russia's role in European history not as a barbaric intruder, but as the alternative West, a living counter-Guelphic pole, whose interventions, from 1814 to 1945, dramatize the buried Ghibelline legacy. The Russian cycles of European abduction are not just acts of mimicry or expansion, but attempts to restore the lost Ghibelline order, an alternative Western civilization grounded in sacred monarchy, unity of church and state, and empire. This explains Russia's instinctive suspicion of Western democracy, liberalism, pluralism, seen as Guelphic/anti-imperial legacies. Its recurring use of orthodoxy, tsardom, and sovereignty as a theological political unity, example the Third Rome thesis. The symbolic resonance of Russian imperial architecture, not just mimicking Renaissance forms, but claiming continuity with the Ghibelline Empire. This pattern reflects more than power politics, it signals a recurring civilizational misrecognition. Russia, governed by a logic of imperial sacral unity, seeks admission into a European order defined by secular proceduralism and post-Guelphic liberalism. Each attempt leads to a rupture, because the symbolic grammar of Russia's civilizational language is unintelligible to the West's modern ears. Tsimbursky's theory of Russia's periodic abductions of Europe, moments when Russia breaks into the Western order only to be rejected, describes a pattern of civilizational denial. From 1814 to 1945, Russia intervened to shape the fate of Europe. Yet each time, the West responded not with integration but with exclusion. The current confrontation is another repetition of this pattern. The West cannot integrate Russia because it does not recognize the legitimacy of the Ghibelline form. But without this recognition, the global order remains haunted by its repressed double. So where the West buried its Ghibelline path, Russia institutionalized it and turned it into the cornerstone of its autocratic, orthodox civilization. Moscow, by claiming succession from Byzantium, the Second Rome, took up the Ghibelline legacy not as a faction, but as an entire civilizational path. Ivan III's alliance with the Holy Roman Empire and rejection of papal supremacy further confirms this orientation. This is why the Kremlin, the last Ghibelline stronghold on the farthest edge of the European universe, is not simply resisting the West, it is challenging the historical legitimacy of the Western order, as if to say, "You buried your true self, we are resurrecting it." Chapter 6. From Pseudomorphosis to External Colonization. Pseudomorphosis occurs when a society overlays imported cultural, institutional shells onto its native core, stunting endogenous development. Likewise, Zinoviev describes supra-society, a la Westernism, as the global imposition of a social model across non-Western societies economically, culturally, politically, creating standardized, colonial-like structures. Alexander Zinoviev's concept of the supra-society, a Western-led, post-democratic managerial civilization, captures the ideological structure of globalization since 1991. Within this model, Russia was expected to become a liberal nation-state. Its refusal to do so is not regression but resistance to a world system that cannot accommodate civilizational pluralism. As the supra-society collapses into fragmentation, the absence of integrative mechanisms, cultural, religious, imperial, is increasingly visible. Globalization, conceived as homogenization, is reaching its limits. Alexander Zinoviev's concept of the supra-society describes the global, post-liberal regime of integration and control that emerged after the Cold War. Within this regime, post-Soviet Russia was expected to dissolve into a Western-centric, managerial civilization. This external colonization completed the trajectory begun under Peter I, the progressive hollowing out of Russia's imperial sacral identity. Russia has long occupied a paradoxical position, geopolitically central to Eurasia, culturally split between Western modernity and Eastern sacrality. The Russian state has repeatedly attempted modernization through imported ideologies and institutions: Enlightenment absolutism, Marxist central planning, post-Soviet liberalism, but none have generated a native political class or integrated nation. Instead, the result has been persistent alienation between state and society, and the emergence of an elite structurally foreign to the majority population. This article proposes that the corporate clan system now dominant in Russia is best understood as the biopolitical culmination of pseudomorphosis. Spengler defined pseudomorphosis as a cultural pathology, when a young, still forming culture is forced to develop within the institutional and symbolic forms of an older one, its own organic life is stunted and misdirected. Peter the Great's reforms marked the beginning of Russia's pseudomorphic age. The forms of Western governance were imposed from above without being rooted in the lived logic of the Russian cultural soul. This condition intensified under the Soviets. Marxist ideology, itself a Western eschatology, became the ruling form, alien to native orthodox, imperial, or communal traditions. Alexander Zinoviev described the USSR as a supra-society, a bureaucratic managerial regime whose ruling class did not emerge from within society but was engineered as a control mechanism over it. The party was not a vanguard of workers but a ruling apparatus whose internal logic served system survival, not societal flourishing. In this sense, the Soviet elite governed Russia as a colonial administrator governs a foreign land, ideologically detached, symbolically self-sufficient, and structurally unaccountable. Pseudomorphosis thus developed a colonial superstructure internally, power became fundamentally external to the people. The fall of the Soviet Union did not dismantle this colonial logic. Rather, it evolved into a corporate clan system, post-Soviet clan system. The post-Soviet clan system is not a modern bureaucracy nor a traditional aristocracy, it is a closed population system with biological, symbolic, and economic features. Entry is through birth, not merit or ideology. Internal reproduction occurs through marriage networks, secret norms, and mutual protection. It behaves as a metropole, extracting resources from society while treating the native population as a governed mass. This system uses not ideology but disinformation, spectacle, and simulated politics to maintain stability. It holds power not through legitimacy, but through functional inertia and the suppression of alternatives. In short, it is post-civilizational, a mechanism of control with no moral, cultural, or ideological mission. The post-Soviet clan system, according to its critics, represents a biological and intellectual decline in elite quality. It wages an implicit war against intellectual, moral, and biologically healthier strata of society because they represent a threat to its stability. This is a classic trait of colonial systems. The ruling caste ensures that the governed population remains fragmented, depoliticized, and alienated from historical consciousness. Healthy, self-aware citizens are seen as subversive. The post-Soviet clan system thus promotes degeneration and uses parts of the disenfranchised population, example criminal subcultures, media pseudo-elites, as informal allies to maintain dominance. Western powers and transnational capital often tolerate, or even indirectly support, the existence of such a comprador elite in Russia because it facilitates resource access, geopolitical predictability, and cultural neutralization. From this perspective, the post-Soviet clan system functions as a buffer between Eurasian civilizational potential and Western liberal hegemony. Its existence delays the emergence of a sovereign, value-based alternative. Yet political revolution or reform alone will not overcome the post-Soviet clan system. What is needed is a civilizational awakening, the recognition by Russians of their distinct historical path, grounded not in liberal modernity but in the Byzantine tradition of sacred sovereignty, integrative imperiality, and spiritual hierarchy. This entails rational reappropriation of orthodox imperial identity. Rotation of elites based on merit, not blood or loyalty. National integration around a Eurasian mission, not comprador management. Only such a renewal can destroy the pseudomorphic shell, break the closed loop of internal colonization, and restore Russia as a civilizational subject rather than a colonized object. Until then, sovereignty will remain formal, and the population will remain politically exiled within its own state. After the Cold War, Russia's pseudomorphic condition became externalized, no longer just mimicking the West, it was partially absorbed by it. Zinoviev's concept of the supra-society captures this phase of postmodern, post-democratic global regime in which Russia was expected to dissolve into the world order. But this very dissolution reignited the archaic core. Post-2000 Russia reasserts itself as sovereign empire, orthodox civilization, and anti-liberal fortress. The Ghibelline impulse, long buried, resurfaces. Russia does not merely oppose the West, it confronts its double. It is the West that could have been, imperial, sacred, unified in state and spirit. Each of Russia's moves into Europe is a return of the repressed. In this light, pseudomorphosis is not deformation, but preservation, a chrysalis in which an alternative West matured while the official West dissolved into secularism and proceduralism. However, this very process triggered a counter-reaction. The post-2000 reassertion of sovereignty, orthodox civilizational identity, and geopolitical independence represents a return of the repressed. The Ghibelline form, long dormant beneath pseudomorphic overlays, has re-emerged in a defensive and projective posture. What appears as Russian authoritarianism may thus be more accurately interpreted as a reactivation of a dormant Western archetype. If history has stages yet to unfold, it is not impossible that the Ghibelline shadow may one day rise again and speak, once more, in the imperial language of the Third Rome. Chapter 7. Westphalia for Eurasia. The medieval Guelph-Ghibelline conflict, a foundational division within Latin Christendom, prefigures the contemporary civilizational bifurcation described by Alexander Zinoviev. Alexander Zinoviev identifies two opposed but dialectically intertwined tendencies. Westernism and communism are not merely ideological formations but represent rival ontologies of social order. Their interaction, competition, and partial convergence shape the dynamics and contradictions of globalization, which emerges not as a unifying resolution but as the universalization of this unresolved internal schism. The dominant narrative of globalization often presents it as a progressive process of economic integration, technological standardization, and normative unification. However, such a narrative neglects the deeper structural tensions that animate this process. Beneath the apparent forward march of modernization lies a long-standing civilizational schism whose origins predate the modern era and whose consequences continue to shape global dynamics. The historical Guelphs and Ghibellines represented two opposing logics of sovereignty and order, one pluralist, clerical, and urban, Guelph, the other centralist, imperial, and hierarchical, Ghibelline. Just as this medieval conflict reflected incompatible visions of political and spiritual authority within Christendom, so too does the modern bifurcation between Westernist and communist lines of evolution reflect an unresolved internal schism within the West itself. This schism continues to define the dynamics of globalization and the structure of its crisis. In the modern age, these structural logics re-emerge as two tendencies within the development of Western civilization: Westernism, or Americanism, and communism, or Sovietism. Zinoviev argues that these tendencies are not merely competing political ideologies but rival paths of civilizational evolution, each representing a distinct mode of social integration, state formation, and cultural reproduction. Their confrontation and partial convergence, particularly during and after the Cold War, did not resolve their opposition but instead deepened their dialectical entanglement. The current phase of globalization, rather than signaling the triumph of one model, reflects this unresolved and universalized polarity. Alexander Zinoviev argues that modern history is shaped by two divergent but interrelated tendencies. 1. Westernism, Americanism. This path reached its apex in the United States and emphasizes pluralism, market logic, democratic fragmentation, and technocratic mediation. Zinoviev links it to the business aspect of modernity: competition, diversity, and institutional multiplicity. He identifies it with a society organized through differentiated interest groups, a multiplicity of parties, ideologies, and organizations, held together only by the coordinating function of the liberal state. 2. Communism, Sovietism. This alternative path was first realized in the Soviet Union and emphasizes central planning, ideological unity, and social communality. It represents the communal aspect of social development, aiming at the total integration of society under a single ideological and administrative order. Zinoviev describes it as an attempt to construct super-societies and even super-civilizations, integrating all social elements into a single, purpose-driven whole. Zinoviev argues that while these two tendencies appear antagonistic, they share certain evolutionary vectors: increased bureaucratization, state coordination, and mass mobilization. However, their ontological assumptions differ. Westernism treats fragmentation as a virtue to be managed, communism treats unity as a goal to be imposed. From the 1950s to the 1970s, Western theorists proposed various convergence theories, suggesting that capitalist and socialist societies were evolving toward a common mixed system. Thinkers like John Kenneth Galbraith, Pitirim Sorokin, and Jan Tinbergen envisioned a future society incorporating the planning of socialism and the liberty of capitalism. Yet, as thinkers like Herbert Marcuse and Jürgen Habermas later noted, this convergence often resulted in the worst of both worlds: the bureaucratic alienation of socialism combined with the commodified atomization of capitalism. What occurred was not synthesis but dialectical absorption, where each system began to internalize the contradictions of the other. Zinoviev contends that this partial convergence did not indicate an ontological blending, but rather the exhaustion of internal potentialities. The Soviet system's stagnation under Brezhnev was not capitalist degeneration but the unfolding of communist logic. Similarly, the socialization of Western economies' welfare states, planning, and regulation was an extension of Westernism's own communal potential, not an importation of communism. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Westernism appeared victorious, ushering in an era of unipolar globalization. Yet this triumph was not the elimination of opposition but the universalization of contradiction. Zinoviev describes the new order as the emergence of human anthils super-societies managed by technocratic elites, homogenized by ideology, and globally integrated through economic interdependence. This phase marks the construction of 1. Westernist super-societies, highly organized polities like the United States or EU states, where pluralism is managed through technocratic administration. 2. Westernist supercivilization, the convergence of these polities into a single civilizational bloc under the ideological hegemony of Western values. 3. Global anthill, a planetary unification of humanity based on the economic, informational, and ideological domination of Westernism. Yet even within this apparent unification, the Ghibelline logic reasserts itself. The growing authoritarianism, centralization, and surveillance seen in liberal democracies reflects not deviation, but the inner necessity of Westernist evolution, the centripetal force necessary to stabilize centrifugal fragmentation. The current crisis of globalization is not an anomaly but the logical result of a dialectical civilizational structure. The West carries within it two incompatible yet co-constitutive logics: the pluralist Guelphian logic of decentralized power and the unifying Ghibelline logic of central authority. In the 20th century, these were embodied in Westernism and communism. Their rivalry, convergence, and mutual appropriation have not resolved their opposition but universalized it. Globalization is thus not the triumph of the West, but the globalization of the West's internal contradiction. The Guelph-Ghibelline divide, far from a medieval relic, is the deep structure of modernity's most expansive and unstable project. The fall of the Soviet bloc marked a temporary victory of the Guelph, Westernist, model, but only at the cost of internal contradictions reemerging with greater force. Westernism's triumph did not eliminate the Ghibelline logic, it displaced and internalized it. The result was the creation of Westernist super-societies, centralized bureaucratic states cloaked in pluralistic ideology, coordinating fragmented masses through technocratic administration. The liberal West cannot universalize itself because its model is culturally monovariant, single format. Its globalization is extractive and value-neutral, dependent on asymmetry between center and periphery. Its post-industrial project is unsustainable without resource and cultural contributions from the non-West. Here Russia enters as a mediating force. Precisely because it never fully westernized, and maintained deep resonance with the Eastern way of life, it understands and can communicate across civilizational gaps, possesses imperial experiential tools for uniting ethnicities and religions, what Panarin calls a superethnic synthesis, offers an alternative model of globalization, not unification by domination, but integration through pluralism. Russia is not merely a state, but a Eurasian civilization that embodies the capacity for interethnic and intercultural synthesis. This stems from Russia's unique Byzantine-Ghibelline inheritance, which distinguishes it from the rest of the West. In contrast to the Western trajectory that culminated in liberal monoculturalism, Russia retains the imperial logic of unity in difference, a tradition of managing heterogeneous cultural spaces without dissolving their internal specificity. This imperial synthesis is neither absolutist nor fundamentalist. Rather, it is flexibly syncretic, capable of holding together multiple civilizations without collapsing them into liberal homogeneity. This mirrors the Ghibelline ideal, the emperor not as a despot, but as a cosmocratic figure who unites differing peoples and faiths under an overarching civil order, the sacral empire, not the confessional nation-state. Thus, Russia's Ghibelline legacy is not only civilization ally distinct, but potentially instrumental for humanity's transition out of the current deadlock of globalization as westernization. Alexander Panarin offers a constructive counterpoint, the Russian capacity for superethnic synthesis, drawn from its Byzantine-Ghibelline heritage. This imperial tradition, unlike colonialism, allowed for the integration of diverse peoples into a sacral political unity. In contrast to the West's extractive liberalism, Russia's imperial synthesis provides a model for reconciling civilizational diversity. Panarin suggests that this Russian function is indispensable to the future of globalization. Without Russia's integrative potential, the global order will remain a utopia suspended in contradiction. Russian philosopher Alexander Panarin offers a vital extension of this civilizational thesis. He argues that Russia's unique inheritance of the Byzantine-Ghibelline synthesis equips it not only to manage internal diversity but also to serve as a bridge between East and West in a rapidly globalizing world. In contrast to the Western model of globalization driven by monocultural liberal utopianism, Russia's historical experience of imperial synthesis offers a model of interethnic and intercultural integration grounded in pluralism, not homogenization. For Panarin, this Eurasian capacity for synthesis is not merely a national asset, but a global resource. As the West faces the limits of its resource-driven, consumerist post-industrial model, the Russian civilizational paradigm provides an alternative, one that emphasizes spiritual renewal, cultural multiplicity, and equitable participation in world order formation. Russia's reactivation of its Ghibelline legacy could thus shift globalization away from domination toward a more humane, multipolar, and integrative planetary order. Russia does not stand outside the West, but beside an alternative version of it. In asserting itself as an empire, a spiritual state, and a bearer of sacred sovereignty, it does not merely defy the modern West, it reactivates one of its buried possibilities. The Ghibelline West may have lost in Europe, but it lives on in the Russian East. From the perspective of civilizational history, Russian pseudomorphosis was not just deformation but preservation. It housed within itself an unresolved civilizational dialectic, now returning under new conditions. Whether the modern West can recognize this mirror, or will continue to see only threat where there is also reflection, remains one of the decisive questions of the 21st century. To resolve the Eurasian crisis, the West must follow its own precedent, the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, which ended Europe's wars of religion by instituting mutual recognition of sovereign identities. Today's Eurasian crisis is likewise theological in structure, waged between a post-Soviet sacral order and nationalist ethnic rejections of it. A Eurasian Westphalia would require recognition of Russia's civilizational sovereignty and its Ghibelline identity, renunciation of universalist claims by both liberal and imperial forces, secularization of sacred political identities into symbolic cultural traditions, acceptance of multipolar legitimacy, a world of coexisting centers, not a single norm. This peace is not simply in Russia's interests. It is the only way forward for the West. A super-society without civilizational synthesis is doomed to dissolve into rebellion and counter-modernism. The Eurasian peace, a renewed Westphalia, is the structural horizon of any stable world order. The theory of Russia's abduction of Europe suggests that Russia embodies an alternative trajectory of Western development, based on the imperial sacred logic of the Ghibelline tradition, which was marginalized in the Latin West after the rise of papacy, the Enlightenment, and liberal modernity. This Ghibelline legacy endows Russia with a unique capacity for interethnic and intercivilizational synthesis, potentially making it a decisive player in a nonviolent, pluralistic form of globalization. The analogy of the Westphalian solution for Eurasia suggests that only through mutual recognition and political secularization can a lasting peace emerge in the post-Soviet space. Without the inclusion of Russia's integrative civilizational potential, the Western project of building a global super-society will remain an unrealized utopia. Unless an alternative to Western liberal utopianism is developed, globalization will remain a brutal, monocentric doctrine. There are two paths to the project of global formation. 1. Geopolitical subordination of the non-West to support Western consumerism. 2. Spiritual reformation towards a multipolar, value-multiple world order. Russia is structurally and historically suited to support the second path precisely because of its civilizational code, oriented towards synthesis, rooted in the same imperial sacred Ghibellinism that shaped its identity. Russia's role as the heir to the Ghibelline West determines not only its difference from Europe, but also its potential value for Europe and the world. Russia's capacity for civilizational synthesis offers a post-Western template for globalization, based not on hegemony or uniformity, but on the reconciliation of heterogeneous traditions. This does not mean that Russia must save the West. But it does mean that its civilizational DNA, its imperial sacred form, can make a decisive contribution to a multipolar world order. The modern world is not post-ideological or post-civilizational. Rather, it is the arena of a meta-historical struggle between two archetypal tendencies embedded within the very logic of the West. Globalization itself is the synthesis and crisis point of this dialectic. To understand the contradictions of globalization, the collapse of liberal norms, the return of state power, the crisis of democracy, the rise of technocracy, we must revisit the Guelph-Ghibelline divide as the deep structure of Western evolution. What we call globalization is in fact the unresolved drama of the West, replayed at planetary scale.